Ownership. Let's say you make a shirt. You physically plant the cotton in the ground, you tend to the cotton all through the process of its growth, then you pick the ball from the stalk and separate the seeds from the ball. Then you do everything that needs to be done to turn that cotton into a shirt. You mine the minerals and create the chemicals needed to get the cotton to clump up in a shirt-like consistency, you sew the patches together, etc. You have created this shirt from start to finish. There is no ambiguity as to whose labor resulted in the creation of that shirt. Do you now own this shirt? Well, if you're Robinson Crusoe, the idea of ownership doesn't have much meaning. If there are a bunch of people around you, then you can use that shirt to the extent that others don't rip it off your back. If they don't believe you own that shirt for whatever reason, and the mob rips the shirt off your back, then practically speaking, you do not own that shirt. There is no objective ownership. When you make a shirt, it doesn't physically attach to your body, right? And of course, that would only matter if the people around you agree that you own the body the brain associated with your subjective perception of being is attached to. Anyway, all ownership is based on intersubjective consensus. And what I mean by intersubjective consensus is just that, subjective. What each subject, in this case people, think. Could be dogs, could be horses, but for now we're talking about people. Inter, relating to each other. Intersubjective, what people think about something in relation to other people. Consensus, something agreed upon, not to be confused with voted upon, agreed upon. I do not mean subjective consensus, as that can mean 5 communists in a city of 1 million having a different belief of what constitutes ownership. Even if those 5 people don't like the private property arrangement of the city, they recognize and respect private property because private property is overwhelmingly supported in the city, and what the limits of the city are being subjective perception, even if somehow defined, city is subjective. Anyway. Practical ownership comes from an intersubjective consensus. And inter means in relation to the other relevant subjects. Sure, the 5 communists have a subjective consensus of communal ownership, but they have to deal with the rest of the city. They have to interact with the rest of the city, and so they must consent to the property arrangements of everyone else in the city if they want to get along. If those 5 communists moved into an uninhabited area, and this area was not claimed by a state, then the intersubjective consensus in that area, as it pertained to private property, would be in fact communistic, whatever the specifics of that are. That the people living in the city have a different consensus of what constitutes ownership is immaterial, and does not intrude on the subjective consensus of the 5 communists. No. The intersubjective consensus is not something I am advocating. It is just a description. Intersubjective consensus is a term I use to describe reality. Of course, there is no intersubjective consensus any more than there is a forest or a herd of buffalo. There are trees, buffalo, and individual actions and agreements. And like forest or herd, intersubjective consensus is a conceptual box. Those birds are loud. When you buy something from 7-Eleven, why is it then agreed that you own that which you bought? When you buy a slushie, does the material nature of the slushie change? No. But when you give the cashier the requested funny money, it is then perceived that you own that slushie. Land works the same way. You own your home because the relevant subjects around you agree that you do. It is the intersubjective consensus that you own that home and the land it is on. Ownership for a home works no differently than ownership for the shirt on your back. This is a very basic outline of the intersubjective consensus as it pertains to ownership. Typically, people refer to the statements of various institutions to determine ownership. For example, in the territories in the western U.S. before the areas became incorporated, the settlers formed claims associations. They would decide upon what exactly constituted ownership of land. They may decide that farming an area for 6 months within any 12-month period constitutes ownership of that plot of land. Leaving a field fallow for a period longer than 6 months within any 12-month period will then result in a forfeiture of that land to whoever proceeds to cultivate instead, or whatever. They come up with some norm and they agree on it. Thus, the dictates of the claims association becomes the criteria of ownership agreed upon by the people in that area. That becomes the intersubjective consensus of property ownership. Some people may decide he does not like this arrangement, but he will have to contend with his neighbor's belief that the dictates of the association are legitimate, which is to say he will have to go against the intersubjective consensus in that area. And this is not fun. But isn't this just a small state? No, not in the slightest.